Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Aaron, great to be with you, man. Good to see you. How you been?
I'm good. How have you been? I feel like we hadn't seen each other a lot recently, and you just had your SKO. And when we record this, I'm about to go off to my SKO, and then spring conference season starts. And so, who the hell knows when we're going to see each other again?
I know. No, I've been good. Things have been good. Weather's broken here. We're not covered in snow and ice, so we can get around. And yeah, things are good. Yeah, you and I are recording some things. I'm recording some things. We're trying to do a whole bunch of shows here before you and I get on airplanes, but we got to make sure we give the people what they want. So. The format of this one, and I recorded one with Brandon Whichard, kind of in a similar vein. I think this one might run a little bit longer, but I kind of said, hey, there's a lot of uncertainty around things right now, especially in the AI space, as it has been for a while. But I said, hey, we've been doing AI stuff for about 3 years, and I say that in the context of ChatGPT. So like for regular people, their experience with generative AI has been about 3 years. And I said, what if we just sort of like walked through, what do we wish we knew about the next 3 years? And that could be as an investor, that could be as somebody who's building a new company, that could be trying to read the tea leaves for trying to help your business. So I made a bunch of topics that, sort of what do we wish we knew about AI in 3 years? Not really making predictions, but or even what do we think is going to happen? But what do we kind of wish we knew in these domains? So what do you think? We'll kind of run through some of these and see if we can make any sense or go from.
Yep. Let's do it. Where are we starting?
Let's start with sort of the economics of AI. We've talked about that a lot. I know we've talked about a lot in the context of right now there's, there are a few gigantic frontier models that seem to cost hundreds of $1 million to train. And those companies or people are throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at them. And the dominant hardware is very, very expensive, very premium. What do we wish we knew about the economics of whether it's models, whether it's the cost of hardware, the cost of software developers, and how that sort of stuff? What do you think about when you're kind of thinking about, okay, where do we think this stuff might go?
Yeah, and this will probably be a general theme for me. When it comes to the economics of all of it, I mean, we'll talk about technology and some of these other things, but it all comes back to the economics. And as we've said on the show many times, follow the money. And right now, the maths don't math. And so from an economic standpoint, I would love to understand in the next 3 years, what does the viable long-term economic models look like? Yeah. Is it I mean, if you listen to Ben Thompson, if everyone has a subscription out there to Ben Thompson, if you don't, go get one. I mean, it's definitely worth listening to and worth reading. I mean, he's still firmly in the camp of hey, all of this stuff at this scale, it has to be ads at the end of the day in the consumer prosumer space. And it's super interesting because, I mean, we've talked about it very publicly on the show. How is some of these big investments in these rounds that just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, how is that going to play out, or if and when it blows up? I mean, we've all seen these things, and there's all this talk about an AI bubble that's happening. And so when does it become rational? When does it become, a return on investment? When do we start talking about all of these things? Every one of these things kind of goes through this initial term where, hey, we're going to go set money on fire because we want to, set up the infrastructure. We're going to do all of these other things. But eventually, all of this stuff has to come down to a return on investment.
Yeah. Well, it's, Brandon's talked about it a lot. When we've had him on, we've done Cloud News of the Month and AI News of the Month. This is the thing that's either propping up or sort of one-legged stool sitting under the entire world economy right now. And it's a weird thing. I think we sort of get numb to the size of the numbers to get thrown around, right? So we're recording this on February 5th. It'll probably publish, I don't know, in a week or something like that. But I mean, just in the last week or 2 weeks, a couple of numbers that got thrown out there. So TSMC. Who is, kind of the center of the fab world for most of these things. They basically said, hey, we're going to raise our CapEx like 40% year over year. So they went from about $35 billion in CapEx to like $55 billion in CapEx for the next year. And so you go, oh, okay, well, that's a really big number. Those are all the chips. But then
let me say something real quick on that before you go further. And this is again goes back to the Ben Thompson thing. Think about this for a second. TSMC said that it's like 55 billion, 56 billion,
right?
And it takes them 2 to 3 years for that to come online. And what we're talking about is 3 years. And so TSMC is investing today for something that is going to ROI.
2028, 2029. Yeah. I mean, they're talking about stuff that 2028, 2029, right? So you have those sort of numbers. And then, just this past week, so between sort of the Elon conglomerates of Tesla, xAI, SpaceX, they sort of said, hey, we're projecting like $20 billion this next year. Meta came along later in the week when they did their earnings, and they said we're raising our numbers from like 100 billion or 110 billion to 135 billion. So you go, okay, that's 155 billion. And then Google came along a couple of days later and said we're raising our numbers from like 150 billion to 185 or 195 billion. So now you're at 400 or so billion. And then Amazon came along today and said we're raising our number up to 200 billion. And you're like, okay, so that's, I don't know, $600 billion on top of CapEx spend. And part of that's going to be data center, but a lot of that's going to be chips, right? Because we're talking about CapEx sort of spend. And you've got the supplier of it going, we're putting $60 billion into our facilities that are going to take a couple years to build. And you're just like, man, there is this crazy amount of demand. Now, not necessarily demand that people want to pay for, but demand to use the technology. And yeah, you're right. The numbers just feel like, not only do they feel like orders of magnitude off in certain places, whether it's like the ability to build chips or the ability to, create energy or have data center space, but you're seeing all these numbers get thrown around that are affecting the market, and then people come back, 6 months later, and they're like, oh, that was just a handshake. That's not an official deal. That's not an official forecast. And you're just like, man, I mean, if we go out 3 years, so we'd be talking about 2019. Yeah, we're talking
2029.
about 2029. Excuse me. I mean, we'd be talking about this capacity coming online at TSMC that they forecast in 2026, and there's $600 billion sitting there kind of waiting in the queue. And it's like, wow, so it's interesting. But yeah, that to me, that's the beginning of that.
Yeah. And there was a time back in the, hey, do you remember that everyone was building a private cloud kind of days, when I remember it was like all the big vendors in the hardware space was like, we're putting $1 billion into building this private cloud.
Yeah.
Like I remember Cisco doing that and HPE doing that. And everyone was like, oh, well, you're putting $1 billion in. Well, I'm putting $1 billion in.
Yeah. That was
now look where we are.
You're right. That was sort of the baseline of like, are you serious? It's like, oh, IBM's doing $1 billion. And it was like, I mean, the simplest way to think about all this is the powers that be in Silicon Valley and it's not all Silicon Valley. I guess it's, sovereign wealth funds and all sorts of places, but sort of the powers that be that either are behind a lot of the technology or are funding the technology have all basically decided, okay, let's take 20 plus years of the internet and cloud computing and mobile and all of these previous generations of stuff. Let's take 20, 25 years, maybe 30 years of that. Let's compress the timeline of that down to about a fifth, and it is a winner-take-all game. There is no, and they're playing it as if that's the timeline. The timeline is like 5 or 6 years. It is winner-take-all, and we're going to be as big as the last 2 or 3, gigantic eras of technology. So yeah, it's nuts. Second thing I had on our list, I just listed politics. Not that we want to get into the politics, but if we sort of fast forward the politics 3 years, at a minimum, the U.S. will have gone through a presidential election, which, again, who knows? They will have gone through at least 2 elections in 2026 and 2028. Who knows what will be going on with Europe? You've got war in Europe. You've got tariffs going on around the world. I mean, this feels about as big as anything. I wonder if the question we should be asking ourselves is like, will we still be sort of living in a period of peace, or will we be living in a period of sort of war? Because tensions feel fairly high at the political level.
Well, I'll even add one
AI
better.
being in the middle of it.
Yeah, if you again predict it out 3 years, where do we think the state of AI is in 3 years? I'm not going to like predict what the technology is going to do, but I will predict this. I mean, a lot of the big models in the sky think we'll have AGI in 3 years. And so what happens to not just politics, but what happens to regulations, which is another topic we'll talk about, when AGI is here?
Right. Yeah.
And how is that going to change everything? Because I think that's going to be the next big, not only is the economics winner take all, but if and when one or more companies achieve AGI, what does that do to the politics of the world? What does that do to the regulations of the world? I'm more interested not in, which, parties or countries or tariffs. I'm more interested in what happens to, how are they going to regulate something like this? Or are they going to regulate something like this? Can they regulate something like this? Or is this going to be something kind of sort of related, but I almost remember it was the music streaming sharing days. It was it was outlawed in the United States, but then everyone just moved all their shit to the Caribbean, or you know what I mean? Right. Hey, you can get AGI in the Caribbean, but you can't get it here. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud of all the crazy things that could happen. Or there's VPNs to AGI because you can't get AGI in your part of the world or whatever, right?
Yeah. So, no, I mean we have distinctly seen before, the idea of there is the sort of Chinese firewall and Chinese internet, and we've seen different parts of the world. I mean, even today, what Europe sees from social media is different than what the U.S. sees, and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see sort of where sovereignty plays out, where some of those other things really kind of play out from there. Yeah. All right, next thing on our list, and I know we're talking about a lot of big things where I don't think we need to spend tons and tons of time. I have technology on the list. I don't even know if I want to touch this one, only because it's all encompassing for one. And number two, I mean, every time you and I get together, which is, sometimes it's once a week, sometimes it's, a month or something. It's like everything we talked about the month before is oh yeah, that's all, that's in the past at this point. So, figuring out 3 years from now, you want to draw straight lines, you want to draw sort of up into the right curves, but those curves could do loops. They could do all kinds of crazy things. Yeah, I don't know that we really want to touch that. I think we're better off just making the show about, how it evolves.
I will simply say this. From a technology standpoint, I think everything will move way beyond LLMs and Gen AI, and even, I won't even say multimodal, but vision and world models and all these other things. I think world models is going to be the next big thing. So, all I'm going to kind of stop there. I don't want to pontificate and I don't want to crystal ball it, but I do want to say, I think the state of AI from a technology standpoint is going to be completely different. And we're going to be oh, do you remember LLMs?
Yeah. We need to put that. We need to put that on the whiteboard. I don't think we've ever talked about world models. You may have talked about them. I never have.
Yeah. We hadn't really talked about it much. It's been an area I've been digging into a little bit here recently.
Yeah. I had regulations on the list. I think we sort of covered that with politics. I think the thing with this is ultimately, if let's kind of put this into real context. In general, the regulations are typically multiple years, maybe a decade behind kind of where they maybe needed to get implemented. And the reason for that is that the people that do the regulating rarely either have insight into how broad something's going to get used. They don't necessarily understand the positive and negatives of what happens. And typically by the time it gets through all the regulators, it's, the technology has moved a whole leap forwards. We saw the beginning of sort of people trying to do regulation with AI. I think we're still seeing it. But I'm going to lump that back into the politics thing. It's a lot could change depending on, who is in charge of stuff and those sort of things. So maybe we skip that piece of it.
Yep.
Next one I have on my list was partnerships. And I think this is going to be, this could be partnerships, this could be acquisitions. I think the way I think about this is, I think it's going to be really interesting. Maybe the most important thing to figure out is going to be, are we going to live in a world in which it's sort of a limited number of very vertical stacks? Or is there still going to be, a lot of sort of layers of the technology stack that can have hundreds of players. It's kind of the way today. It's like, yes, there's 3 or 4 major cloud providers, but there are hundreds of SaaS providers, right? You don't have to get all your applications from anybody. And I think that's going to be really interesting because we're sitting here again on February 5th. We're watching all of this, at least value destruction of the SaaS companies, because people are like, well, maybe a lot of that application layer stuff is going to meld its way down into LLMs or agents or something. So I think it's an interesting time to be like, hey, what will the future stack look like? And I think that's going to impact, partnerships or, not partnerships.
Well, and something else that kind of popped in my head while you were talking about that, because when you're talking about partnerships and like big roadmaps and everything, like my head immediately goes to like the running joke for us and, on the infrastructure side and the cloud side was the cloud native landscape, was it the CNCF landscape with the hundreds of, logos on it kind of thing of all the different companies that participate in all the different spaces. And quite frankly, when it comes to AI, I'm sure there's an equivalent kind of landscape of like all the AI companies that are out there. But I'm also wondering, that, as all of this builds out, does the level of investment required, does the barrier of entry almost become too high? Like we went through a period where, maybe it was thanks to the CNCF, maybe it was just thanks to the, 0% interest funds. Like it was decently easy to get started. And, the age of SaaS and the age of the internet, what I worry about when I see all of this is, are we going to reach a point where the barrier to entry for solo founders or small teams and maybe folks with not necessarily as much funding, does that actually become pretty hard to do?
Yeah. Yeah, right now it feels like the layer of thousands is just wrappers on top of the API. Yeah, I think there's going to be a different layer of figuring out, how do you get to play in the game? What's the cost of playing in the game? And is there still, again, those cheap ways to get in? And again, maybe that spurs something on the open source side or some sort of community side, but still feels like a very costly game to sort of get started in. All right, next thing on the list, I had both buying patterns and usage patterns. I think we could probably blur these things together a little bit. My thinking was less on the sort of consumer side, thinking about this on the enterprise side of things. Right now, the buying pattern, the sort of dominant buying pattern in enterprises is, hey, this is how many people I have, sign me up for X number of seats of Copilot, Gemini, Cursor, whatever it is. I wonder if that continues, right? Does it just become sort of becomes the office of going forward, or do we find new buying patterns where I know the SaaS people are starting to think about outcome-based types of things? I think it's an interesting concept, but it's a very hard thing to sort of pass forward. It's hard to go to your CFO and go, we're going to have 4,000 outcomes this year, so sign us up for, you don't know what you're going to have. Yeah. Which I think, the more I think about it, like it's a cool concept to say like, hey, we're going to charge people based on, on buying patterns. But the bottom line is you still have tokens flying around back and forth. And number two, you think about like cloud, and the original idea for cloud was like, well, just pay for what you use. And then you look at the buying patterns became so dominant on like, here's a big contract, let's pay for multiple years in advance. Let's just get out of the forecasting of what we're going to use. Let's just give me access to stuff. And I feel like that always becomes the default thing. So I'll be really curious if anybody figures out a way sort of make the payment based on some sort of outcome.
Sure. So I have maybe this is a hot take. I just thought of this as you were talking about this. First of all, I think the cloud usage patterns, I think, will pull forward. So the idea of, you're going to be paying per token. Sure. That's your base model. Like I think the paying per seat, you're going to see less and less of that going away. And the reason why is because the economics change so fast, with GPUs and everything else in the stack. But then I see just a massive amount of tiering that's going to happen, not just on performance, but also, the biggest thing with AI is latency and time to first token, or, as things are streaming by. And I almost feel like when I pull out my phone and I do, Lyft or Uber, and it's like, hey, do you want to pay an extra however many, to see this now? Right. Yeah. And so I think there's going to be this huge tiering system of like, hey, do you want to rent the Ferrari by minute, or do you want to rent the super slow car, depending on your needs? how fast do you need to go? And then there's also going to be the, hey, do you want the extra upgrade for the even faster thing just to, like how impatient are you?
Right.
And so it's this almost like metered plus response times plus patience level.
Yeah.
For lack of a better term.
And I could see that. I could see that potentially working out on the consumer side of things because it's, it's your level of frustration. It's your level of importance. I see that being a really hard thing to do on the enterprise side of things, right? On the business side of things, because it's like, the business side of things always boils down to, well, I've got 500 people using this service and I know that there's really only like 10% are power users. But I don't want to pay power user tier for all 500 of them. So I'm going to pay lower tier. And then when they complain, maybe I'll figure out a way to get some higher end sort of thing. Yeah. I mean, the other part of that, it kind of goes back to the, and maybe this becomes the thing that becomes the thing that does it. But it's, it's sort of like the argument they've made on the web for a long time of like, well, the web should be like micropayments, so, oh, you want to read this article? Okay, cool. Instead of having to subscribe to the New York Times, like I could make a micropayment for this one article or this, or whatever it might be. And they just haven't figured out the sort of the underlying mechanics of being like, how do I do micropayments and port, and it was supposed to be Bitcoin and all that kind of stuff. And that just hasn't, so maybe this ends up driving a new frontier of, sort of payment models that are easier to use or, allow you to put some stuff in a till and it's like, yep, yeah, I'm frustrated, hit the button, cool, take a little bit out of that. And, but yeah, I could see that. I could see that becoming
no matter what happens, there will be one universal truth. This will all be run by the CFO with a spreadsheet.
Oh God, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
There's going to be some CFO going, no, we cannot afford that. It doesn't matter. Don't care how much the developers complain. We're using the cheap tier.
Yeah.
Then everyone's going to be like, why do we use this tier? And it's like, oh, because the CFO said we don't have any money.
Yeah. And you're going to have Shadow get around that tier and all that kind of stuff. So
that's never going to change, no matter what happens.
I think the other thing, as far as usage patterns go, I mean, I think usage patterns, we are so early in the cycle. I think what it's going to be very interesting, we're going to see a generation of people, just like we've seen in the past, who it's like, this is their native thing, right? Just like it was like, oh, we have phone native thing. We had sort of like web native kids, right? They always had internet, right? It was like post Gen X, they always had the internet. Then you had the ones that were like, oh, they have always had a mobile phone in their hands. You're going to have the ones who are like, they've always had AI, available to them. And then I think if somebody figures out a device, that becomes a completely different or some other mechanism. But I think until we've lived a few years of like what that looks like, where you have to work with one of those folks or, there's entire companies of people who are like, I just look like that. I think it's going to be hard to figure out usage patterns. I do think it's interesting to sort of watch some of the companies that are starting to say like, hey, we're going to make, how you use AI an evaluation criteria, for, how you're measured on your job and stuff. I know Meta's starting to do that and some others and stuff, but I think that'll be interesting because right now, when I look at most of the AI tools, like they're not designed to be shared. Like they're not easy to share. They're not, and it's like, maybe that becomes the next thing. But right now it feels like AI is a very individual sport, not a team sport. And I'll be curious to see if that becomes, especially on the enterprise side. Right now, everything is an individual sport, and maybe that's the only way it can work when you start introducing things like customizations and memory and other stuff like that.
That's a good point. I never thought of that, but it's so true. It is really just at this point in time that I feel like the state of AI is, it's per seat based and everyone's different, and the team stuff just isn't there yet for sure.
Yeah. Last thing I had on my list, the one that we all sort of, kind of avoid talking about because we don't know and we don't really like what the answer might be is I had job creation / destruction on here. And I only point this out, because obviously we end up talking about it. A lot of times we talk about it in the context of software developers. I mean, it could be any white collar worker, but I think it has some interesting sort of bigger trickle down things, right? It's going to impact what gets taught in schools, whether it's at elementary school level or university level. It'll be interesting to see where, if you had some sense of like, okay, where job creation's going away, you're going to have people that figure out, I'm going to go after certain businesses because they look like, I can figure out a way to put people around that and create a better user experience around that and so on and so forth, versus being like, I'm taking my investments out of these things because there will be no more, different. There'll be no more sort of the Chick-fil-A, hey, my pleasure sort of thing. You'll just be in the drive-through, and every one of them will be the same. And but I think knowing the industries that are actually seeing either creation or destruction, I think will be very interesting to sort of watch over the next 3 years.
Yeah. And so, and a couple thoughts on this, because again, we both have kids in college, and I don't know about yours, but it's so interesting to see not necessarily the kids' reaction, but the professors' reaction to all of this, and like putting just the fear of death into the kids of what will happen if they're caught using AI and this and this and this. And there has certainly not been an embracing, at least at the college level and the university level. So that's, kind of one thought on it. But then another thought I had is like, okay, the same way, like, okay, the gig economy, right? Like the gig economy came along and everyone was like, oh, this is amazing. And then some people were like, oh, it's awful. And yeah, it changed the job market in some way, shape, or form. It allowed people to kind of control their own destiny, make money when they want to make money. But then, maybe you want to call it late stage capitalism, but, people figured out like, Airbnb, and then it was companies that owned Airbnbs, and then some of these companies owned, like basically all the Airbnbs in a town, and then now you can't hardly find something that's not related to these companies, and kind of ruined the gig economy. And
right.
And so, like, what's going to happen when a new economy pops up out of this? And then, even worse or better, what happens when everyone figures it out and then everyone starts to optimize the system?
Right. That's what it is. I mean, we see new thing, bunch of entrants, people aggregate, people optimize. I mean, one of my daughters who's sort of on a path that's sort of medical nursing sort of thing. Yeah, like you said, a couple years ago in college, it was like, hey, don't cheat and use ChatGPT. And now she's got certain things she's doing or interviews where they're asking her like, hey, how would you use AI in this scenario that's relative to the domain you're studying? And so it's sort of flipped from being like, well, don't use that, don't cheat, to this is what you're going to deal with and go figure that out. It'll be fascinating. I just think about that like at a real basic level of like, you have tier, even in like the medical profession, right? Like you sort of have tiers of like, okay, you have, let's say doctors are sort of the top tier, or a specialist doctor is the top tier. Well, you could be a nurse and you could be like, well, man, I can jump on ChatGPT and look at these. I could look at an X-ray. I could look at symptoms. I could look at test results, and man, I could know as much as the doctor is. And do we need to have the doctor? Do we start seeing nurses often open their own offices instead of having to be tied to doctors? And I think it's going to be another interesting, kind of where in the hierarchy of stuff do things start to break down? Where do you see new aggregations happen? It's going to be fascinating.
I'll give you another interesting one too. So for those that are out there that have been in our industry, there's this concept of expert networks. Yep. And, Brian and I have both been involved with them at various times in our careers. And typically you can't participate in them if you're with a publicly traded company. But if you're not familiar with expert networks, there's a bunch of companies out there that will go out, find a bunch of networks. And a lot of times it's investors, and investors will like want to talk to these experts. And so it's companies that pair the two together. You get paid. You get paid for your expert knowledge in an industry, and you get paid by the hour. And it's, hey, it's a nice little side gig sometimes. Yeah. Well, I've been with public companies for, 5-6 years now. And now I'm with a private company. I was like, oh, some expert networks approach me and kind of dip my toe back in the water. And it's so funny. One of our friends, a mutual friend, I won't disclose his name publicly, but I'll tell you afterwards, Brian. But it was interesting. He was like, yeah, the expert networks are a fucking mess. And I was like, why? And he's like, well, because all the expert network people basically are using AI, and they spam like, 1,000 people for one opportunity because they can now using AI agents. And then 1,000 people reply back because they take all the questions that you have screening questions. They put all those in AI and reply back. And so now you've got 1,000 people replying and all replying back with the same answers. It's like, well, how do you, and then they get on things with investors. And now there's these things where like you have to do them live, and you have to be sitting there and you have to share your screen to prove you're not asking AI the questions that the investor is asking you. And you have, like, it used to be just phone calls, and now it's like, they want to look you in the eye and like, are you really, talking to me? And so.
Yeah. Everything's cheating.
Yeah. That's what it's come down to, man.
We're going to have to change the name of the podcast to the Cheating Cast.
The Cheating Cast. There you go.
It just applies to everything. All right, man. Well, we covered a lot of stuff. I don't know how long we've gone here, but I feel like we've gone long enough. Yeah, again, the goal of this was not to have answers, but to sort of be like, these are big areas. It would be nice to know certain things in the future, as it's always been nice to know. But I thought it'd be worthwhile to sort of talk through, like, what do you think either might happen, or what are your concerns about a space? So I think we covered that okay. So, all right, folks, with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thanks to Aaron for being here before he jumps on an airplane, and thanks to all of you for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for you that have been sending in requests for the show. Like we just did one for Alex around sovereignty. So a show at thecloudcast.net if you have any questions, or hit us up on the social media. So with that, we'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.